Over the past few months, I've been very, very fascinated with this concept of hypertrophy training for strength training, right? So transitioning off the novice linear progression into more intermediate style programming, advanced style programming, and I found these other YouTube channels, starting with guys like Andy Baker in the Starting Strength world, and then also branching into dudes like Alex Leonidas, aka Alpha Destiny, Natural Hypertrophy, Bald Omni Man, aka Paris Butler. Great channels, right? And I'm watching these dudes, and I'm noticing it's very similar to Starting Strength the way they approach their training. They have a heavy emphasis on progressive overload. There's a lot of heavy compound movements. There's emphasis on the calorie surplus, right? And they're very strong. But they also do all these smaller movement patterns too, right? So I'm kind of taking a look and I'm thinking about it and noticing in Starting Strength, we prioritize loaded human movement patterns. And then these, bodybuilders are prioritizing the muscles. Or are they, right? And then it just hit me like a ton of bricks all of a sudden. And I had this Zen moment and I realized hypertrophy training is just movement patterns. But just there are more movement patterns in hypertrophy training, right? So the way I was thinking about it is in Starting Strength, we've got a vertical press in the overhead press, right? Just the press for us. We have a horizontal press in the bench press. We have a squat, we use the low bar squat. And then we have a hip hinge, which is the deadlift, right? So that could also be like a good morning. It doesn't have to be a deadlift, which is why I use the term hip hinge, right? That type of movement. And then sometimes there are chin-ups and barbell rows. So that would be a vertical pull and a horizontal pull, right? But there's more than just that, right? Your body has a lot of different muscles, a lot of different joints. So that's going to cover the bulk of it. But if you want to really maximize your muscle growth throughout the entire body, you have to incorporate more, right? Whether it's for aesthetic purposes or also I would argue for strength purposes, there's benefit to including some of these other movement patterns, right? So for the upper body, just for pressing, I was thinking there's 4 different planes of pressing, right? There's the vertical press, which is an overhead press, right? Then you've got incline pressing, right? Incline bench, that kind of hits the middle point. Horizontal pressing in the bench press, and then decline pressing, which could be like a decline bench or it could be dips as well. So anything, basically vertical press, overhead like this, incline press like this. Make sure you make fists and 2 arms, not 1 arm, right? Horizontal like this, straight out, and then decline kind of down this way. So like a dip or, a decline bench. And then as far as pulling, it's the same angles, right? Vertical pull, so like chin-ups or pull-ups right here. Then you've got incline pulls right here, which are like Alpha Destiny's ghetto pull down is a good example. But just anything, like an inverted row could work as well. But you just kind of like change the angle of the pull down. The horizontal pull, like a barbell row. And then a decline pull, which could be like a very heavy barbell row, like a Yates row kind of. Or you could also do like an upright row, something like where you're pulling in this plane, right? But those just hit largely the same muscles, but to varying degrees, right? You have a long spectrum of how to hit each muscle. But all those muscles are very useful in a lot of the main lifts, so like squatting, bench pressing, deadlifting in particular, and then especially in pressing too, actually, I would argue. All of those are very important. And then on top of that, we have triceps extensions, right? So like they can be overhead or in front, but just anything where you're extending the elbow like that. They can be like up here if you want, doesn't matter, The more overhead they are, the more the long head of the tricep you get, which is pretty important. And then we got curls, right? Little elbow flexion kind of deal. And then there's lateral raises for the side delts. If you're trying to look saucy and look jacked, right? You got to do those a little bit. And then we have, wrist curls for forearms, also arguably important for looking saucy. Perhaps less carryover to strength with the lateral raises and the wrist curls. And then we have neck extension / flexion, getting sillier with it. But, there's a place for that if you care about that. And then for the lower body, we have the squats. We have the hinges, which I said could be like deadlifts or good mornings. The squats are just like any variation of squat from low bar to high bar, or low bar to front squat, or like goblet squat, I guess is more extreme than that. And then there's knee flexion movements, right? So like a lying leg curl. So, if you're loading the deadlift or the squat, for example, you're not actually loading the knee flexion portion. It's mostly eccentric. It's not a concentric knee flexion. So if you want concentrically loaded knee flexion to train the head of the hamstring that crosses the knee more thoroughly, then you have to include some of that. And I think that would probably carry over well to some of your compound movements. And then for calves, anything with your ankle, that may help your squats and your deadlifts. You might have a little bit more stability there. And then spinal flexion for the abs, which I would argue also carries over well to pretty much all your lifts if you decide to train that in isolation. So that all being said, all those movement patterns, right? Why the heck would you train this way, first of all, right? So my response would be, that, first of all, make sure you're not a novice, right? Because if you are a novice, you don't have to include any of these. And the biggest constraint, the biggest argument against doing this is really just the time constraint, which I'll get into that more a little bit later. But like, it's going to take a little bit more time to get through all these movements, right? Because there's a lot more of them. Or will it? But I'll touch on that in a second. But a stronger muscle is a bigger muscle, which we know, until it isn't, right? So if you're doing your squats, your presses, your bench presses, your deadlifts, you can run those up, right? Run your novice linear progression, get as strong as you can get. Your muscles are going to get a lot bigger while you do that. And then you can keep running that in, different variations and kind of like pushing the PRs further and further apart. But what happens is, eventually if you're just doing the same movement pattern over and over, you just adapt to doing that, right? So you're probably going to get more bang for your buck splitting things up into these different planes of motion. It's also going to be more fun, and you're going to stick to your training. The science is compliance, as Stan Efferding says, right? And so through doing that, you get your muscles bigger, which then in turn makes them stronger, obviously, right? So it works both ways. A stronger muscle is a bigger muscle, but a bigger muscle is also a stronger muscle, right? So you can kind of use both so they feed each other. Another benefit of training this way is that the tools don't matter in the sense that you're just trying to get the target movement pattern on the target muscle, and it's not a competition lift, and you don't care about the strength on these lifts, right? So you can just kind of use like dumbbells, machines, barbells, easy bars, whatever you have available essentially. Maybe even bands, I don't know. Like that could work. It'd be hard to progress, but you could do it. But there are benefits in terms of the workload and actually the time as well, because with these smaller movements, you don't have to rest 5 minutes and sit there, waiting for your forearms to recover after a wrist curl, right? You can rest like a minute, maybe 2 minutes. You can superset a lot of these movements, because the idea is that even though you're doing a superset, your performance might suffer a little bit, but you're better off doing the movement rather than not doing it at all, right? So even if you're doing it to 85% instead of 100%, that's better than not doing it at all. And then as far as the workload, right, you can get through like 6, maybe even like 8 movements in one session by doing that. And they're small movements, so you're going to recover just fine, and you work up to it over time. You don't just go into doing like 4 sets of 12 for 8 movements or you're going to die. But yeah, it also has a conditioning effect if you do it that way as well, which helps with your main lifts. So if you're doing, like giant sets or supersets, you're going to be breathing pretty heavy. There's a lot of burn going on in the muscles, which is specific to the main lifts as well, right? So you learn to deal with that better. So then when you go back to doing like heavy sets of 5, ideally you're, incorporating those at the same time. But it carries over to your sets of 5, right? Because it's a more specific conditioning effect. Like if you do a set of 20 hack squats, the next time you do a set of 5 squats, you're not going to get as gassed. You're not going to be as winded. Your muscles aren't going to, start burning, and it's not going to suck as much, essentially. So how would you incorporate stuff like this at the start? Well, the easiest way to do it that I found, a ton of different ways to do it, but if you've been doing a full body split, you can still continue to do that. It's just going to take a lot longer probably if you're doing like 3 main lifts in the same day, for example. So what I prefer to do, and you can still do that, there's nothing wrong with that. You just have to add the extra stuff at the end, so it's going to take a little longer. What I prefer to do is like an upper-lower split, where you might have, if you've been doing 3 main lifts with like say squat, bench, deadlift, you'll have a day where you do like press and bench, and then a day where you do squat and deadlift. And you can do 4 days a week like that, right? So like Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, upper, lower, upper, lower. And on the upper body days, you might do your press and your bench. And then after that, you're just doing, these different kinds of pulling angles, maybe even like different press angles that you're not hitting. And then the other day, you can hit the opposite ones. And then for your lower body, you can do the squat and deadlift. And then you can just include some of these muscles that are probably going to get neglected otherwise. So like the calves, the forearms, the side delts. And then you can still train those even though you just trained upper body the day before, because you're not quite hitting those that hard. And then, then you have the day after to recover. So it's not going to interfere with your next upper body session, right? So basically when you introduce the movements, you just treat yourself like a novice on those movements. So you're just doing, you can do like a sets and reps scheme, and then progress from there. Or like I said in the last video, I like to use double progression quite a bit. So you can use that double progression, but start off with just, make sure you're hitting the top of the rep range, and then just keep adding weight until you don't hit the top of the rep range. Then just kind of stay there and double progress. But yeah, I think that's basically it on that topic. If you guys have questions, say something in the comments. I'm going to be experimenting with this style of training over the next few months. So I'll be posting training footage and talking about what I find here. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. All right, goodbye.